Hello everyone, this is Michael, and today we're going to talk about the legendary band Rush. Rush, of course, is the power trio that emerged out of Toronto, Canada in the early 70s. They were initially mocked and even ridiculed by the rock press and ignored by the corporate head bigwigs at that time. However, their fans were extremely loyal and supported the band throughout their lengthy multi-decade journey, and in fact many fans have passed on their love of the band to their children, and who have also embraced Rush. Many of their fans have actually become musicians themselves, movie directors, actors, comedians, writers, directors, captains of industry, and many of those fans have expressed their appreciation of the band and the art that they've created, to the point that Rush is now widely and rightly seen as one of the best, most accomplished, and most influential rock bands in all history. There are 5 things about Rush that particularly impress me. The first is the work ethic, especially in the early part of their career in the 70s and into the early 80s. They worked tirelessly. To be fair, many bands did back then, but Rush in particular seemed to never take time off. They would make an album, they would tour in support of the album, and then they'd get maybe a couple weeks off, and then they go back into the studio, make another album, tour in support of the album, and they did that cycle endlessly from their early days, 1974, really until they reached to the point where they were financially successful enough where they didn't have to just be on that treadmill. But even then, they kept working hard. As you'll see, that they never had long periods of time between albums over the first, 15 to 20 years of their existence. That's number one. Number 2 is we have the same 3 guys. Yes, John Rutsey was the drummer on the original release, but for most of the band's history, it's been Geddy Lee on bass, vocals, synthesizers, and all kinds of other things. Alex Lifeson on guitars, and Neil Peart on drums and contributing most of the lyrics. 3, we have a band that never stopped evolving. Every single album sounded different than the album before, and when you spread it over time, they evolved from a hard rock band in the 70s to a heavy prog band in the late 70s to a sort of new wavy synth band in the mid 80s, and then eventually to a more kind of structured rock band in their later years. Sorry, my cat is bothering me here. So that's the 3rd thing, is they just constantly evolving. The 4th thing is their virtuosity. Each of the 3 are among the best musicians. Outstanding. Geddy Lee is arguably one of the top 2 or 3 bass players in the history of rock and roll. Neil Peart is arguably the greatest and most influential rock drummer in all history. But what really differentiated Rush to me is they employed that virtuosic musicianship in service of the songs. They weren't playing their instruments a million miles a minute just to show you that they could, which is something that I think a lot of bands suffer from, especially in modern progressive metal and modern progressive music genres. A lot of guys who are technically skilled but don't know how to express that skill through the song. Rush were absolutely brilliant at that. That's 4. The 5th is these guys' ability to recreate their sound on the stage. Their albums in the studio were dense and had this big sound to them, often with layers and layers of music, but they always recorded it with the idea that we're going to be able to replicate this live on stage, just the 3 of them, and they did that. The fact that those 3 guys could stand on stage and create that rock symphony, it truly was a rock symphony, is just utterly brilliant. Nobody else has been able to replicate it, simply no one else. And so Rush today is rightly seen as one of the greatest, best, and most influential rock bands in all history. Let's get into it. Because they have such a big catalog, I'm going to have to break this up into 4 parts. Part 1 is going to be the first 11 studio albums, which span from 1974 to 1987, which that tells you something right there. That's 13 years, and yet they put 11 albums out in those 13 years. Second part will consist of the final 8 studio albums from 1987 to the final one, Clockwork Angels. Part 3 will be their live music and live DVD catalog. As most of you should know by now, I'm a huge live music DVD guy, and we're blessed to have a large catalog of live music from Rush that we're going to look at. And finally, I own, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 box sets, depending what you define a box set as. And I'm going to give my review of each one of those. Some are really, really awesome, and some are not so great. So that's it. Let's get into it. We're going to do part 1, starting with their very first studio album, released in 1974, was the self-titled Rush. As I mentioned before, this is the lone album with John Rutsey on drums, as opposed to Neil Peart. And as you can see, I give it a 72, which is a pretty good rating. Looking at my scale here, that's very good for the most part. Maybe doesn't have the highest highs or suffers from some low lows. This album bears little in resemblance to what Rush became known for in their later years. This is pretty straightforward early 70s hard rock, and it does not distinguish itself from a lot of other music that was released at that time. It's also the first album where the lyrics were not written by Neil Peart, and so you have Geddy Lee singing some, "Hey baby" lyrics, which really did suit him, but he did his best at it. You can see here that none of these songs are bad, but they don't really stand out other than the ones that we have. Number 1, Finding My Way, which we just listened to a minute ago, and that song stands up to this day. Now, it's pretty straightforward hard rock, but it's good. Same thing with Before and After, which is a song that does have a light part and a harder part, so it's a little more dynamic. And then the song that most people are familiar with, and which definitely is the song that kind of broke Rush, especially in the U.S. Midwest, which is Working Man, which is about a 7 or 8 minute long song that features a lengthy Alex Lifeson guitar solo. And that song picked up airplay from a Cleveland radio station, and that enabled Rush to break out of the Toronto club market and allowed them to start touring throughout the Midwest. And Rush was among a number of bands that emerged out of the U.S. Midwest during this time period and employed the same formula that eventually launched all of them to stardom, which was: you play in clubs and get a record contract, you record a record and you start touring, and even if the record doesn't spawn millions of sales or radio hits, the combination of the album and the touring, almost always in opening for other bands, would eventually get a band enough exposure to the point that they would break. In addition to Rush from Toronto, you had Cheap Trick from Chicago, you had REO Speedwagon. Also from Illinois, you had Ted Nugent from Detroit. You had Styx, also from Chicago. I'm thinking of some other bands. They're more like that employed this. Bob Seger from Detroit also. That was a common path for bands to make it back then. And so Rush, their first album came out, they had a minor hit with Working Man, and they started a endless cycle of, like I said earlier, they toured relentlessly, often opening, getting no more than 30 minutes on stage and being the special guest, which meant you were the first of 3 acts. They especially were linked with Kiss a lot. They opened for Kiss a lot during this time. This album did not, obviously make huge stars of them, but nevertheless, a decent start, a good quality album. It did soon become apparent that John Rutsey was not the right guy for the drums. This is 2 reasons for this. One is that Geddy and Alex were more ambitious. They wanted to start making more progressive music, whereas John Rutsey wanted to play straightforward 3-minute rock songs and sing about girls and cars. And the second reason that John Rutsey wasn't right is he suffered some physical ailments. I believe he had diabetes, and his diabetes made it a challenge for him to keep up with that endless, working schedule that Geddy and Alex were willing to embrace. And so John Rutsey was soon out, and they brought in Neil Peart as the drummer. His audition, they loved it so much that they asked him to join the band immediately. He accepted. Neil Peart had already spent a couple years in London trying to make it in the London music scene and had become disillusioned with this and had returned to Toronto. And the idea that these three guys, all from Toronto, all about the same age, somehow come together to create this band that would eventually be what they were. That, again, I've said this before, it's one of those things that makes me believe a God exists, because it just seems impossible. So now with Neil Peart in tow, and him being a very well-read man with a lot of ideas, he took over most of the lyric responsibilities, which the other guys were perfectly happy for him to do. And Neil Peart initially wrote a lot of lyrics that were inspired by great literature or science fiction or great literature and science fiction. And so a lot of the lyrics in the early years reflected that. These weren't personal songs or love songs. They were often songs about a place and a time far away. So let's go to album number 2, which is Fly by Night. And a distinct change. As I said, every album evolved for Rush, and this is no different. Fly By Night was a significant departure from the first album. As I mentioned, we have lyrics that are looking at things like French history and these sci-fi themes that I mentioned earlier. And you also have a band that is starting to lean into their progressive ambitions, specifically on the song By-Tor and the Snow Dog, which is their first real multi-section song. It's got at least 3 distinct sections to it, including a very cool bridge in the middle where it starts out real quiet and they got these weird sounds going on, and features one of Neil Peart's very best drum sections on any studio album. That song in particular, which as you can see is the lone song I give 100, really expressed the ambitions of the band and where they wanted to move forward. Beyond that, Anthem, the very first song which I mentioned, is this one is inspired by Ayn Rand, which would be something that the band would become somewhat notorious for. Sometimes they didn't particularly appreciate that. And then Making Memories, which is it's a funny song because it sounds like a song that would come from a band that had been on the road for many years. But this was on their second album. That's a good song. And then In the End, which is the other song that I rate as an 80. The other 3 songs, it's interesting. Fly By Night was probably the most commercially successful song on this album, but I'm not a big fan of it. It's a relatively simple and straightforward, like 3-minute song. Same thing with Beneath, Between, and Behind, and Best I Can. All of them are fairly standard hard rockers that reflect more like what they were doing on their first album than here on their second album. However, you can see that in total it was a 74 rating. So their first 2 albums come out and good, not spectacular or legendary or anything like that, but a good start for band. But the album did not particularly sell very well, didn't have any radio hits. The band continued to tour in support of other bands, but they weren't climbing the success ladder just yet. Notice that album came out in 1975, which is the same year their very next album, Caress of Steel, came out. And you can see here, by the way, this is that quiet section from By-Tor and the Snow Dog that's so cool. Caress of Steel, you can see I rate as an 86. This is I'm pretty sure we're going to see that this is a departure from what other people think of this album, because it's probably one of the lowest regarded albums of the band's early career. The band was very ambitious with this album with only 4 songs. Interesting. I always thought there were 3 songs on side 1. Anyway, Bastille Day, pretty straightforward hard rocker, but it's got some of that almost kind of orchestral sound to it that makes it sound a little different than your average rock song. I think I'm Going Bald is somewhat a silly, dismissive song. Lakeside Park is it's a straightforward rock song, but I like it a lot. It's one of what I think Rush don't get enough credit for writing kind of that 4-minute, sing-along song. And Lakeside Park is that. It's got a feel-good vibe to it. It makes you feel like you're sitting on just like the song says, watching fireworks on Canada's equivalent to the 4th of July in the United States. But it's really the last two songs, The Necromancer and The Fountain of Lamneth, that define this album, because the Necromancer is almost 10 minutes long. It's clearly their effort at a multi-part progressive epic. It's got 3 distinct sections. It's got all this Tolkien-esque, clear Tolkien imagery, and they specifically cite Tolkien characters from The Hobbit and the Fountain, the Fellowship of the Ring, and that trilogy. I love it. I think hardcore Rush fans really like it, but the guys talk about playing that song specifically for the guys from Kiss when they were touring together, and they could just tell the guys from Kiss were like not getting it. And I think Gene said, "Why don't you write songs about girls and cars?" And that's how a lot of people reacted to Caress of Steel, especially that song, and then The Fountain of Lamneth. The Fountain of Lamneth is the band's first, most ambitious effort. It's 20 minutes. It has 5 distinct sections to it. Actually, let's look at the Necromancer, which has 3 distinct sections to it. I mentioned. I think it's a 100 song overall. The middle section is my favorite part, but sections 1 and 3 are also really good. Fountain of Lamneth, however, has 6 sections to it, and I love this song. Everything about it, other than that part, Panacea, which is a very acoustic, quiet thing and doesn't really fit in with the vibe of the rest of the song. But I really like this song because it showed how they could combine hard rock with progressive rock and make these transitions. They'd go from loud and fast, or loud and hard, to kind of quiet and soft, and they would do so effortlessly throughout this song. I really like Caress of Steel overall, and The Fountain of Lamneth, and then the Necromancer in particular. And that's why I give this album such a high rating. We're going to see later that my opinions on Caress of Steel are probably out of step with many others. Caress of Steel was a massive failure, both commercially and critically. The album did not sell at all, and during the band's tour in support of the album, fans were not reacting positively. The band soon found themselves playing smaller and smaller shows, not getting offered as many good opening slots, and things were kind of falling apart, to be honest. They jokingly called the Caress of Steel tour the Down the Tubes tour, because they were really worried that it was the end of their career. They were not sure that the record company would even give them the ability to record another album. Now, their manager, who was a big supporter, did convince the record company to fund a 4th studio album, but it was with the expectation that the band would play more commercially viable music with shorter songs that were designed to be played on the radio. And the manager kind of told the record company, yeah, that's exactly what we're going to do, but that's not what the band had in mind at all. They believed in themselves, and they were not going to do what others wanted them to do, no matter how many people or told them or what their reasoning for it was. The band doubled down. Their side 1 of their next album would be another 20-minute multi-part side-along song about a dystopian future where music was banned. And it's not an exaggeration at all to say that that decision to ignore the music critics, ignore the music company, and believe in themselves enabled everything that came after for the band Rush. All of the great albums and music that they produced afterwards may never have happened had they not made that decision to make what became known as 2112, which, as you can see, I have ranked as a 94, which is a true classic from start to finish that has withstood the test of time, and 2112 is absolutely that. It is often ranked among the very best hard rock albums ever, the very best progressive rock albums ever, the best concept albums ever. It deserves all of its accolades. It has absolutely withstood the test of time. And when it was released, the band knew it immediately, that they could sense that people were responding to it much more positively than previously. Now, it didn't generate a whole lot of radio airplay. They didn't become big through radio airplay. Instead, it was old-fashioned word of mouth. And the fact that they'd been touring now for 3 or 4 years, constantly getting out in front of fans and playing their best in front of them, that's how they built their loyal following. And I can tell you, as somebody who first exposure to Rush was the album 2112, and I hadn't even heard it from anyone else. I bought it through what was known as the Columbia Record Company deal, or Columbia Recording. I don't know what. There used to be this deal where the record companies would send you a mailer in the mail, and they would send these things to everybody who had a home, I think. And they would they would send you 10 or 11 or 12, I can't remember exactly, 12 albums, and all you had to do was pay 1 penny for them. But you had to agree to buy a lot more. But a lot of kids like me took advantage of that. And there were like albums that it seemed like always showed up on those things. Albums like Aerosmith, Toys in the Attic, Fleetwood Mac, Rumors, Thin Lizzy, what is that? Jailbreak, is that what it's called? Yeah, Jailbreak, Ted Nugent, Cat Scratch Fever, and Rush 2112. So I bought 2112 simply because I'd heard friends and older brothers and things talk about it, and so I wanted to hear it as well. So I bought it without having ever heard the band, because I had to get 10 or 11 albums out of this choice here. And I think a lot of kids found that way. That was how a lot of people discovered Rush, is you'd be over at a friend's house and the album was on. Your older brother would tell you about it. That's how Rush became so big. And 2112 was absolutely the album that projected them into superstardom. Like I say, they were in really bad shape after Caress of Steel. And while their fortunes didn't turn around 100% with 2112, in many ways, it changed the direction and the trajectory, and they went from going down to now they were going up, and they would keep going up for the very near future. As you can see, we have 2112, the song, which is the 20-minute epic, and we have to look at that in more detail. It's broken up into 7 sections. Every section is brilliant. It's utterly absurd how good this song is. One of the things I really want to point out here is how everything they do is of such high quality. The music, the lyrics, and how they put it all together. And I want to specifically talk about the opening. So it's got this swirling kind of synthy sound. I don't think it is a synthesizer. I think it was a machine in the studio that they used that created that kind of swirling sound. And then it immediately transitions into that beginning. Da-na, da-na. And from there, they just take off on that first song, Overture, which is, like it says, an overture. And holy cow, are they killing it on the instruments during that section. And that's one of those, it's instrumental for the most part. They have one line that they tack on the very end, the meek shall inherit the earth. But for the most part, that is an instrumental. And that's one of those instrumentals, if you play and you have people my age, anyone my age, they know that shit, and it will make them start air drumming. I mean, just incredibly good. And then you have the Temples of Sea Rings. And what I really want to talk about here is Neil Peart's lyrics. Yes, the song and everything is awesome, but these are the opening lines to this song. We've taken care of everything, the words you read, the songs you sing, the pictures that give pleasure to your eyes. It's all for one and one for all. We work together. Common sons never need to wonder how or why. And I want to just talk about that little stanza right there. Those are all simple words in short, simple to understand sentences. We've taken care of everything. You don't have to do anything. We got it. The words you read, the songs you sing. Oh, wait a minute. You're taking care of everything. What I'm able to absorb. You're providing me anything that goes into my brain. So you get a very clear picture that this is a authoritarian culture where there are people up above determining what the other people can even think. They show that music has been outlawed. And they do it in, we've taken care of everything. Where'd you read songs, pictures, they give pleasure. It's all for one for common sons never need to wonder how or why. So you are not even supposed to question what it is that you're being fed. So in a very, very brief stanza, you get a clear vision of what's happening here. You have a dystopian society where music and probably movies and books are, if not outlawed, controlled tightly by the authorities, by the temples and the priests. I just cannot express how powerful that is. I compare it to Dream Theater's The Astonishing, which is 2.5 hours of music, and if you were to take all the lyrics and combine them, would make up a significant, probably 30 pages of typed, written lyrics. And they never give a reason for why music is banned that music doesn't exist in that album. I think the best they give you is that people just don't seem to have the time anymore. So Dream Theater takes 2.5 hours and can never express why the music has been banned. Neil Peart writes 6 sentences and tells it in very simple, clear, easy to understand words. That is super powerful, and he employs that throughout this album. You have the song 2112, all these great transitions. You got Geddy Lee singing the part of multiple characters, and you don't have to be told who the characters are. You can tell in one case he's the individual who has discovered a guitar, which we experience in Discovery. He brings the guitar to the priest because he's so excited about it, wants to share it with him and wants to share it with the others. And then he plays the role of the priest who basically shuts him down, says it's nothing new. We've seen it all before. This is what killed the elder man. And so our protagonist, and that's the conflict here in the song is you have individual versus the state, individual versus the collective. And after being shut down by the priest, our protagonist is demoralized. He has a dream. He sees what a world could be like where people like him, an artist, are free to pursue their ideas. And when he wakes from the dream, he's saddened that he commits suicide. At least that's the way I read it. And then you have the grand finale, which is another instrumental. Again, it's only about 2.5 minutes. But again, the band is just killing it on the instruments there. And this is a good example. They are playing their asses off. This is virtuosic music. But it's in a 2-minute instrumental that captures the end of this 20-minute epic. And you hear at the very end, attention all planets of the Solar Federation. We have assumed control. And it's left to the listener to determine who took control. Did the priest take control back? Did the meek inherit the earth as they promised at the beginning of Overture? Or is it even some outside party, some third party that's come in and taken control during the vacuum? They leave it up to the listener to decide that. Brilliance. I cannot. Just 2112 is awesome. Now, you could argue that I was 12 years old when I heard this, and it shaped my entire worldview of music and what could be done with it. And if I were 44 and heard it for the first time, it wouldn't affect me as much. no doubt, when you're 12 or 13, music is going to hit you more than when you're 50 years old. Nevertheless, a truly epic, great 20-minute song that propelled Rush to superstardom. After that, side 2 consists of 5 fairly standard songs. A lot of people don't like side 2 of 2112, and I don't understand it because I like these songs. A Passage to Bangkok is probably the most commercially successful of these, the most well-known because I don't know. And that song to me is the least compelling. I really like Twilight Zone. I like the weird vibe that they play on it. I think it captures the kind of mystery and darkness that the Twilight Zone always had. Lessons is a song that transitions from acoustic guitar to hard rock, and I like that song. It's really good. Tears is a somewhat unusual song. It's a very quiet ballad. But again, I like it. I like the lyrics a lot, and I don't think Neil Peart wrote the lyrics for Tears. I could be wrong. And then Something for Nothing is a hard rock song, but again, it's Rush playing a hard rock song the way a good hard rock song should be played. I like that song. We'll never tire of listening to that song. And so overall, when you add it up, 2112 is a 94, which makes it between a true classic and perfect. It's a very, very high score. Now, like I said, during the touring of this album, the response from fans was clearly more energetic, more positive than what they had received during Caress of Steel. They got offered more, better gigs. They even were starting to headline some smaller places, 3,000 seats, that kind of stuff. And they took advantage of that by playing a series of dates at Massey Hall in Toronto, their hometown, that they headlined. And then they recorded for a live album. And we're going to look at the live albums when I get to part 3, when we look at all the live stuff. I'm sorry I keep looking down, but my cat keeps rolling around on my feet. She's wanting attention. The live album that they released, All the World's a Stage, I can tell you that album played as big a role in making them a rock, one of those bands that everybody had in their high school bedrooms, was All the World's a Stage. And I actually got into Rush more as a result of that album than their other studio albums. I think that was the second album I ever got, and man, I listened to that album a lot. That's what introduced me to the By Tour and the Snow Dog. It also was the album that had Neil Peart's drum solo on it, and I can just remember me and my friends freaking out over that drum solo, especially the one part where he's playing just his bass drums with his feet, and it's and I'm just like, I did not know you could do that with your feet. So All the World's a Stage played a really significant role in keeping that momentum up that the band started with 2112. Nevertheless, the band after 2112 easily could have simply said, okay, that worked, let's do that again, but they absolutely did not. They had more ambitions. They wanted to expand their sound, and each individual member started adding things to their repertoire. Geddy Lee added Taurus pedals and a Mini Moog synthesizer. Alex Lifeson added Taurus pedals as well, and learned how to play classical 12-string guitar so that he could add that. And then Neil Peart added orchestral bells and glockenspiels and xylophones and chimes and all these kind of symphonic drum things. And when you add all that up, they went from being a 3-piece rock band to a 3-piece rock orchestra. Now, they were just entering this phase, and we're going to see that it just kept going. But man, that really expanded their palette of sounds that they could employ on their next album, which came out just a year later. So again, just keep working, which is A Farewell to Kings, which I rate as a 93, almost as good as 2112. Now, A Farewell to Kings continued their lyrical explorations. It also continued their desire to create progressive music. It in many ways, this is where Rush is creating a genre that I would call heavy prog. It combines progressive ideas like you would hear from Jethro Tull or Genesis or Yes, but they're using hard rock to express those progressive ideas, which none of those other bands, I guess Jethro Tull sometimes got into hard rock, but Genesis and Yes did not. Now, King Crimson was their own thing, and they definitely could be hard at times, but they are also more artsy than Rush ever was. Heavy prog, progressive rock combined with the hard rock elements that you would see in bands like Tool and things like that moving forward. I feel like this is Rush creating that genre. Let's look at the songs individually. Farewell to Kings is a 5 to 6 minute rocker. It opens with all those things I was just talking about. Alex Lifeson on classical guitar, or 12-string guitar. Neil Peart playing chimes, something he didn't have on his drum set before. And Geddy Lee is using his synthesizer. So the very beginning of the very first album, after their most successful album, employs a bunch of stuff that you didn't find at all on any of their albums before, which is really bold. And Farewell to Kings is awesome. I love that song. We have two songs that make up 22 of the 38 minutes on this song, and the one of those is Xanadu, and the other one is Cygnus X1. So we got to talk about each of those at length. Xanadu is utterly brilliant. Has a lengthy opener of Alex Lifeson using volume on his guitar. It's a really cool section. The transition from the quiet early parts to the harder parts on this song are just truly impressive, and that's one thing that Rush does all the time. I've talked about this over and over and over about Black and White, about the ability to move from dark to light, and I mean the ability to combine loud with quiet, fast with slow, hard with soft, urgent with relaxed. Rush covers all the palette. They can tell a story with all of the ways that they create these motions with their sounds, and Xanadu is an absolute brilliant example of it. It's Peart again citing classic literature, Andrew Lloyd Coleridge, I believe in this case. And I love that song. Now, I know that later in their career, they would cut the song down to from about 10 minutes to 6 minutes. They would cut one of the verses out. And I heard Geddy Lee talk about it. He said, yeah, when we were young, we liked that song so much, we used to play it twice. And they kind of do. They play it twice. Who cares? It's so good, play it twice. It should be 10 minutes. The music ideas in that song deserve a 10-minute performance. The second long song is Cygnus X1, which in many ways is the most artsy prog song that the band might have ever done. This is a 10-minute epic. The first 5 minutes, I don't think, have any lyrics whatsoever and consist a lot of spacey, atmospheric, distorted sounds. And you hear words being spoken, but they're distorted and hard to understand. They're not really lyrics. And then it transitions into a very proggy instrumental, and Geddy Lee with some of his most high-pitched, shrieking vocals ever. And the thing is, that was just part one of the Hemisperes story. It was cool when you got the album because it would say Cygnus X1. I believe it was part one Hemisphere. I can't remember what the full name was on the album, but it said to be ... to be continued, meaning they would finish it on their next album. And that was kind of cool stuff Rush would do. I mean, I'm going to try and find out what the actual name was, the longest version of the name. Let's see if I can find this. Yeah, Cygnus X1 Book 1 Hemispheres. That's the official name of the song. So they were leaning hard into this sci-fi, progressive, arty kind of, music, branding, whatever. And it was cool. Those of us who were into it loved it, and a lot of fans did too. Now, A Farewell to Kings did not sell quite as well as 2112, but it kept up the momentum. Rush was now headlining theaters and arenas and had gone past the days of having to be an opening band. They were an established rock band. In fact, they went over to England for the first time and played at Hammersmith Odeon over there, which is kind of one of those classic rock venues that every band needs to play back then. Outside of those songs, we also have Closer to the Heart, which is another one of those kind of 4-minute pop songs, even though it starts out with a very quiet acoustic thing and then becomes, it's almost, I don't want to say a power ballad because it's not a ballad, but it starts quiet and then becomes a rocker and has a kind of an anthemic sing-along. Cinderella Man, maybe a 60 instead of an 80. It's one of those kind of weird Rush songs along with like Twilight Zone that's kind of underrated in my opinion, and Madrigal is a quiet song. I want to note that because I have it rated as a 60, and I believe that's the last 60 song we're going to see for a while. We're not going to see another song that's rated as low as a 60 over the next 3, at least, albums, I believe. But nevertheless, despite having a song that's rated as a 60, this album still comes in at a 93. So we've now had 3 consecutive albums at 86, 94, 93. And that is super impressive. And cannot say enough about what the band has created to this point. After touring extensively in support of A Farewell to Kings, Rush entered the studio, but they didn't have any material written yet, and so they had to write their next album while in the studio. And the next album was just a year later. I could talk about how they just constantly putting out new material. And this is the album Hemisperes, and this is my favorite Rush album of all time. I just cannot say enough good about this album. Now, to be fair, the band members found recording this album to be extremely challenging and difficult. Part of it is they made it hard on themselves on purpose. We'll talk about that in a minute. But as we look at the album, there's only 4 songs on the album. So this is prog rock in that side 1, 20-minute single side-long piece. It continued the story we started with Cygnus X1. It is utterly brilliant in my opinion. I love the 20-minute Hemispheres. It is the story of the gods trying to control mankind. It's a battle between art and science, left brain, right brain. Cygnus from Cygnus X1 originally is the bringer of balance who balances the 2 sides, art, science, left brain, right brain, the 2 sides of the hemisphere. This Hemispheres, I don't think has the popular mass fame that the 2112 song does, but I think among hardcore Rush fans, I bet at least half of us probably prefer Hemispheres over 2112. I don't care. I think it's utterly brilliant. Cannot say enough good about it. After that, side 2 consists of 3 songs. Circumstances is a straightforward 4-minute hard rock song, but it has a break in the middle of it where they use the chimes and the orchestral bells and all that stuff, and it creates a cooler sound, a more dynamic sound for a hard rock song than you usually get. Then you get The Trees, which opens with, again, 12-string acoustic guitar and is an allegory of how those in power don't understand why the tall trees don't understand why the smaller trees want more light, and the smaller trees are wanting more. It's an allegory for mankind. And then we get La Via Strangiato, which is a 9-minute instrumental that is supposed to represent a series of dreams that Alex Lifeson had. Arguably the greatest instrumental ever made, in my opinion. This is virtuoso musicianship being expressed in a way that literally swings. I mean, the opening, which is a very extended opening, a quiet opening. I remember I played this. I have a Chinese guy that worked for me for a while, and he and I became pretty good friends, and he didn't know music, American music, much at all. I played that song for him, and he just lit up. He liked the opening. He said, "Oh, it's like the sun coming over the horizon and morning." And that is a pretty good description of what the opening of La Via Strangiato sounds like. From there, it just goes on a wild roller coaster of a ride, and you are Geddy Lee on the bass, Neil Peart on the drumming. These guys are just Alex on the guitar. All three of them are killing it throughout, and yet it moves and it swings. And holy crap, I can remember the first time I heard La Via, and it was mesmerizing. And I was working in the yard yesterday, and it came on a random playlist, and I loved it as much yesterday as the first I heard it in 1978 or whatever it was. Hemispheres, in my opinion, just so, and you can see when these are the parts of the song Hemispheres, the 20-minute epic. I think they're all fantastic. I especially like this part here, which is Cygnus. There's a break there where it gets quiet and Cygnus comes in and arrives. And then the very end, kind of a coda, the sphere, which kind of wraps everything up. I really like the dynamic of how they brought that conclusion in with Cygnus, and then the coda with the sphere. Just utterly brilliant. Can't say enough good about Hemispheres. So at this point, the band has been kind of evolving in one direction. More progressive, more hard, more virtuosic. And they'd kind of reached the apex of that with Hemispheres, and they found the recording of it so arduous. And this is what I mean when I say they made it hard on themselves. They were adamant that when they were in the studio recording their songs, that it would be one take. They would play, they would do overdubs and fills and record certain things individually, but the framework of every song was the three of them in the studio playing it live as three-piece. And they kept trying to do that with La Via and couldn't get it down, and they eventually surrendered, and they took 3 edits and combined them together for what you hear on the record. They didn't have to do that. They were making it hard on themselves, and later they eventually agreed that, maybe we don't have to be so rigid about that stuff. But it had been so difficult that they came out of Hemispheres with a desire to move in another direction. They wanted to write shorter songs. They wanted to not be so over the top with the virtuosity, and try and write more concise, simpler songs that they could take all the ideas they had, but try and package them in smaller packages, if you will. And the end result was 1980's Permanent Waves. Now you can see it looks to be 2 years, but I don't remember when Hemispheres came out, but I'm pretty sure it was the fall of 78, and then Permanent Waves came out in very early 1980, so it's like 15 months apart, so it's still very apart. And Permanent Waves is, again, I got it as a 95. That's now 4 consecutive albums that are 93 or higher, and 5 if you include Caress of Steel, it's 86. That is unreal consistency. That is utter legendary performance to have 4 albums in a row that are basically classics, and that's what Rush is doing here. Let's look at Permanent Waves. Permanent Waves, number 1, we have 6 songs, and there's nothing that's sidelong here, but Natural Science is 10 minutes long, Jacob's Ladder is 8 minutes long, Free Will is like 6 or 7. These are not short 3-minute, 4-minute pop songs. They're still progressive, but they are more accessible and friendly to the average listener than what you had before. Spirit of Radio, and you can see the lyrical changes now. Before, Neil Peart was writing about things that were in faraway places and faraway times. The Spirit of Radio is a pretty simple idea, which is radio can inspire me when I get up in the morning and on my way to work, and I hear the song on the radio, and it just brings a light to me. That's a simple idea. Jacob's Ladder, one of the rare hidden gems in the Rush catalog, in my opinion, has very few lyrics to it, even though it's, I think, 8 minutes long, but tells the story of a storm approaching and then striking and then receding away. And they capture that stuff, especially there's a synth part in the middle that, to me, is supposed to represent a beam of sunlight coming through the clouds, and I love the atmospheric dynamics of that song. We'll never get tired of that song. Natural Science, again, is a 10-minute epic. It's got 3 distinct parts to it. So it's not like they're writing 3 or 4 minute songs. They're not as crazy as they were with like A Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres, when they were very, very aggressive in trying these lengthy, very challenging, ambitious pieces. I saw Rush on this tour. It was the first concert I ever saw was Rush in 1980 on February 2nd at Tarrant County Convention Center in Fort Worth, Texas. My older brother took me, and my buddy Glenn Keels, I believe. And they were as good as I hoped they could be. It was spectacular. I enjoyed it. It made me want to see more live music. It made me want to listen to more Rush. It was super cool. Just another truly fantastic album. And so now, like I say, that's 4 consecutive albums. This is a band that is firing on all cylinders and playing at the absolute peak of their abilities. And yet we're now 7 albums into their career, and the band has been going, just nailing it for the last 5 years. And yet it's in 1981 when they release their most critically and commercially successful album, Moving Pictures. Moving Pictures, I believe if you go to the Progressive Archive site today, it is ranked as the number 2 album all time. It's often listed on many many lists as the best this, the best that, and it's well deserved. This is an album that is true classic. If you're a rock music fan, a hard rock music fan, a progressive music fan, a metal fan, any of those genres, you're going to enjoy this album. It's got 7 songs. Each one is distinct and individually great, but collectively they tell a band that is reached the apex of their abilities and can do no wrong, really. I can't... most classic rock fans would be familiar with probably every song on side 1, which consists of Tom Sawyer, which is easily Rush's most commercially recognizable song. You hear it in hockey arenas, stadiums, video games, TV shows, commercials. It shows up everywhere. Red Barchetta, a song about a car. Rush finally writing songs about cars, but of course it's much deeper than, hey, I got my hot rod. YYZ, a 4 or 5 minute instrumental, which is one of the greatest instrumentals in rock music history. One of my favorite things on the live music stuff that we're going to look at in part 3 is the band playing in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and 40,000 rabid Rush fans singing along to the melody of YYZ, an instrumental. An audience singing an instrumental. Freaking cool. Limelight is a really simple song for Rush, and it was clearly designed with a radio audience in mind, in my opinion. I don't think they were trying for hit songs, but they were probably to themselves thinking of something more casual and more accessible. And then side 3 is kind of, the more progressive side. The Camera Eye is a 10-minute song that goes through. It does have a traditional arrangement, unlike songs like Cygnus X1, which does not have a traditional arrangement. But it's got so many extended parts to it, from a very slow burn opener that I think is just brilliant. especially Neil Peart's drumming on it. I love it. Witch Hunt is, it was listed as part 3 of Fear. So you have an album that comes out and it says, we got this song Witch Hunt, and it's called part 3 of Fear. We haven't seen part 1 or part 2 yet. Somehow this is part 3. But if you were to put those, part 1 and part 2 came out on their next 2 albums, and if you put them together, it's a pretty good concept piece that lasts about 18 minutes. So they still weren't, it's almost like okay, we're still going to do these lengthy ideas. We're just going to work them into smaller pieces. And then the final song is Vital Signs, which employed kind of reggae drumming and this kind of new wavy sounding guitar. And that was recorded in the studio. And that was something that the band would do occasionally, is specifically leave time to record a song in the studio. And it would usually be more, would use more aggressive or ambitious studio effects, and would be kind of a highly produced song. New World Man is another example on the next album of that. Just can't say enough about Moving Pictures. It is rightfully regarded as a truly legendary rock album. It's fantastic. It deserves all the accolades, all the awards. And so now we've got 5 consecutive albums. I will put this run of Rush up against any band's catalog in terms of quality and consistency. Most importantly, they're evolving every single one of these albums. If you were to listen to Caress of Steel and then listen to Moving Pictures, you wouldn't even know those are the same bands. The sound palette is so much more ambitious, more dynamic on Moving Pictures. Geddy Lee's vocals are much more subdued. He's not shrieking in that high-pitched wail like he did earlier, because he probably couldn't anymore. You have the lyrics are completely different than anything you hear on Caress. It's a completely different band. In 5 years, they completely reinvented themselves, and yet every single album they released during that time is a stone cold classic. That is an accomplishment that is rare, and I know that the Rush guys like to talk about they feel like their career began with Moving Pictures, and that everything that came after is what the real Rush is. I've read Neil Peart saying that. But they are remembered today because of this run right here. Yeah, they've had a lot of great music since then and even before, but those 5 or 6 albums, I feel those are the things that when people talk about their love of Rush, that's usually what it's talking about. Before moving on, I still want to mention a couple things about Moving Pictures because I feel it's warranted. First, I want to point out how the lyrics have become much more personal, dealing with real world things that people encounter every day, as opposed to these science fiction, fictional pieces about faraway places and faraway events. Second, this album was hugely commercially successful. It reached #1 in Canada, #3 in the US, and really, while Rush was already a very well-established band that was touring and selling millions of records, Moving Pictures elevated them to a higher stratosphere that was the height of their commercial success. And then finally, I mentioned that this album shows up on lots of lists. I looked this up because I wanted to see. So Kerrang! Magazine has it as number 43 among the 100 greatest heavy metal albums of all time. Rolling Stone has Moving Pictures at number 10 on the 2012 Readers Poll, Your Favorite Prog Rock Albums of All Time. Has it at number 3 on the 2015 list, 50 Greatest Prog Rock Albums of All Time. And at number 379 on the 2020 edition of the 500 Greatest Albums of All Time. And in 2014, readers of The Rhythm voted Moving Pictures the greatest drumming album in the history of progressive rock. And then finally, Moving Pictures and 2112 are both listed on the list 1001 albums you must hear before you die. So that just gives you a sense of how popular and critically acclaimed Moving Pictures is. Now, after Moving Pictures, the band recorded another live album. Why am I forgetting the name of it? Exit Stage Left. Not nearly as compelling as All the World's a Stage, in my opinion, for a number of reasons. But nevertheless, the band came out with another album just a year later called Signals. And as you can see, this is a dramatic drop-off in my grade scale. We went from all these, basically true classics to a 79, which is nearly an 80, which is still outstanding. Do not get me wrong. It's below these other grades, but a 79, I have bands with a dozen albums in their catalog that I really like. I like the band, and none of them are as high as a 79. So let's not paint this as a failure or a mistake or anything like this. It's still a high quality album. It's just different. And there's a number of reasons why. One, synthesizers, which used to be support instruments, are now a lead instrument. Most of the, not all songs, but a lot of the songs have synthesizers as the primary kind of instrument, with guitars as an accessory. And that is not a great development, in my opinion. I would prefer to hear guitars, and this period is a time period for Rush where I think Alex Lifeson in particular looks back and wished that guitars played a more prominent role. It did show that you could take synthesizers and integrate them with this hard rock sound and still be successful. There are less guitar solos, just less guitars in general. And also, these songs really aren't hard rock. I just said they combined synthesizers with hard rock, but these songs are not really hard rock in the sense that, like, Finding My Way from their first album was hard rock. It's a different sound palette, and I can tell you, I was a huge fan. Like I said, I saw the tour on Moving Pictures as well as I had seen the one on Permanent Waves, and that was the first show that I ever got up to the front. Me and my buddy snuck down onto the floor, and during the last half hour of the show, we were right up at the front of the stage, and seeing guys play in front of 20,000 people. This was at Reunion Arena in 1981, and seeing three guys playing on stage from really close was really powerful, and it made me unwilling to watch shows from the second deck of the arena after that. Anyway, Signals was a much different thing, and I can even remember on Moving Pictures, I remember a buddy of mine who, he and I had been Rush fans for a while, and we were talking about the song Limelight and how, yeah, we like it, but it sure sounded like the days of Hemispheres and 20-minute epics and things like that were over. And sure enough, Signals just kind of confirmed that. Now, I grew to really like Signals. I didn't like it at first. I didn't even buy it. When I heard, let's look at the songs. When I heard Subdivisions, dun dun dun, with the keyboard opening, it's kind of mid-tempo. It sounds, there's no Geddy Lee shrieks. There's no Neil Peart drumming, craziness. Everything is just much more subdued on this album, with less extravaganza, if you will. Nevertheless, the songs are really good and hold up. And you can see Countdown is the 60. Remember when we were on A Farewell to Kings, and I said Madrigal was the last 60, 3-star, 60 rated song that you're going to see for a while? Sure enough, we went through Hemispheres, Permanent Waves, and Moving Pictures without a single song rated as low as a 3 or 60. And here we get one, but it's at the end of the album after you have a bunch of hundreds. New World Man is my favorite song on this album, even though it's a 3-minute rocker. Again, they record in the studio, but man, it's just got a vibe to it. Like I say, that's them swinging. New World Man's super cool. They're all over the place here in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. It's an impressive album. It's just different, and there are a lot of fans that did not embrace the transition to the synthesizer sound. This is really the beginning of the synthesizer era of Rush, and some people embrace it and some people not so much. I like it. I got it as a 76 or 79. It's not as great as these other albums, but in my opinion, it's still a very solid album. They followed it up the next year with Grace Under Pressure. Pretty much sounds the same as Signals, in that you've got synthesizers, a de-emphasis of guitars. You've got shorter songs. Most of these songs are 5 minutes now. But even these 5-minute songs allowed them to do things like you have extended intros on some of the songs. you've got arrangements that are a little more ambitious than you would get on a simple 3-minute pop song. You've got some extended instrumental sections. Let's look at the songs from Grace Under Pressure. I like the idea. They said that thematically they were trying to capture how people show grace while being in difficult situations where they're under pressure. And they were talking specifically kind of about themselves. They were feeling the pressure to produce a good album, but we have interesting lyrical themes. So Red Sector A is about Holocaust survivors, which if you don't know, Geddy Lee's mother is exactly that. She's a Holocaust survivor. She went through truly horrifying experiences when she was young, and it really shaped Geddy Lee's life because he was aware his mother had survived all this, and so there was this feeling that you had to make something of your life and live up to honor the fact that she had managed to survive such a horrifying event. You have After Image, which I didn't realize except during research for this, that was about a member of the studio team who had passed away in a car accident. The Enemy Within is the part 2 of Fear. In this case, they're talking about, actually it's part 3. They're saying, fear begins from within, and that can be crippling and debilitating, which is always interesting because I always like to remind myself that 95% of what we get anxious and scared of never comes to pass. Body Electric is this is interesting. I always thought it was about an android because it says Android on the Run right at the beginning, but it talks about a robot trying to break its programming. But again, in research for this, I read that what Neil was really trying to accomplish here was talking about us as individuals trying to break free of the consumerism that is basically shoved down our throats from the day we're born, that we must buy things to make us happy, and that we need to participate in the free market commercial machine. That's a real allegory that I had never picked up on because I'm not smart enough on those things. Though Kid Gloves, I got it rated as a 3. I like Kid Gloves. And then Between the Wheels, I'm not a super fan of. It's a kind of a mid-tempo thing, very heavily keyboard oriented, and it just doesn't hold up as well as the rest of the songs on this album. I'll be honest, after these 2 albums, I grew to like them later, but when they first came out, I was not super big fans of them, and I was into heavy metal. I was listening to Queensryche and Iron Maiden and Metallica and bands of that ilk, and Rush was seen as kind of geeky and nerdy, and they weren't that cutting edge, hard, heavy metal band that I was really into at that time. Now, like I say, I grew later to embrace both those albums and really like them. And the reason I embraced them and grew to like them is because I picked up Power Windows, which you can see I have here as an 88. This should be higher. I'll tell you this. Before doing the work for this video, that score would have been 100 because I love Power Windows so much. But in looking at it, I'm like, look, I can't have Power Windows higher than 2112 or higher than Hemispheres. It's not better than those albums. And I would say this today, it's not. But in terms of my enjoyment, it's just as good. I listened to this album from beginning to end just the other day, and it made me realize I shouldn't have changed those scores. I should have left them at hundreds, because you can put any one of these songs on and I'll love it. You can put the entire album on and I'll love it. This is the band reaching the apex of their synthesizer era, and for some people that makes it horrible. My buddy in college used to call this album Bogus Windows. I love everything about it. They leaned heavy into the synthesizers. They're adding digital samplers, and there's a heavier emphasis on electronic drums. The production on this album is just a masterpiece. the sounds sound like they're coming at you from everywhere, and they just swirl around your head. Put this thing on headphones, and it's in my opinion, it's the greatest balance of synthesizers, digital sequencers, electronic drums, all that digital stuff. This album is the best sounding album that captures all of that. It's from a technical perspective, it is utterly brilliant. And then I love every song, and I feel like all three band members are just killing it throughout. Now, one thing that I think is really notable is these songs are fairly long. There's 8 songs, but I believe every one clocks in at least 5 minutes. I think one is 4 minutes and 50 seconds, but Marathon is like 6 minutes, Territories is like 8. And I bring that up because every song seems to be a journey, and they use a lot of progressive elements throughout the album, but it's mixed in with this very technically advanced sound. What I mean, this part right here in Grand Designs, it's, first of all, the song sounds like it ends and comes to what is a false stop, and then they have about a 30 or 40 second outro, and it uses a very progressive device that Rush has used a number of times, where they have a pattern of not having a pattern, and instead of going dun 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 dun, they're going dun 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 dun. They're changing it every single time as they do that outro, and I love that stuff. It makes what would be simple and rather predictable become complex and unpredictable, but in a way that still grooves and keeps that honesty with the song. Big Money, I love this song. Grand Designs, I love that one. Manhattan Project, obviously about the Manhattan Project. I changed a lot of these scores from 100s to 80s without listening to them, and I regret that. I think if I were to listen, if I listened to any one of these songs right now, I'd give it a 5, which is 100. But I just can't, in good conscience, also say that Power Windows is a better album than Hemispheres or 2112. So how can I reconcile that? 2112 and Hemispheres are not only legendary, they were genre defining. Like 2112 created that sci-fi hard rock prog rock sound. Hemispheres is, like I say, arguably heavy prog being created right there. Power Windows does not have that, not because it wasn't equally groundbreaking, it's just that it didn't influence as many bands afterwards. People didn't embrace that idea of layers and layers of electronics and digital stuff, so it's not as influential and it's not as impactful. Didn't have the impact that those two albums and some of the earlier albums had. Nevertheless, for me, man, I love Power Windows. It is a truly, truly outstanding album, and so it really should be ranked up here in these mid-90s, and that's why I decided to make the first part of this the first 11 albums. This period of Rush from 1974 to 1985, I mean, that's only 11 years, and they put out 11 albums, 9 of which are arguably classics. I just can't say enough about how impressive a catalog that is. The band constantly evolving, changing their sound, being more dynamic, and eventually evolving into a band that was unlike any other band, and not anybody even remotely close to doing what Rush could do. Just totally, totally unique and different. Alright, this is a good time to start, so we will begin right here with part 2, and we're going to look at the band's final 8 studio albums. I hope you'll join me for part 2, but until then, I'm out. Thank you.